Right, thanks everyone for getting up early and coming along and hearing this. So, as Kelly said, chances are that most of you are fairly familiar with at least the basics of what I do and what I talk about in most of my talks. And generally when I give lectures to transhumanist audiences, I tend to try to spend as little time as possible on the introductory stuff and talk about new stuff and different stuff as much as I can. But I know that since we are, after our first transhumanist conference in Asia, that there will be quite a few people here who are not so familiar with the material that regulars like me have presented in the past. So I'm going to try and give a bit of a hybrid talk, and I thank Ben for giving me the best part of an hour to do it so that I can essentially try to please everybody. So this is, of course, is the title of my talk, and of course the key word in the middle here is healthy. We are not in the business of developing therapies for the purpose of the extension of the miserable part of life at the end. However, unlike many of my colleagues who work on the biology of aging and who also emphasize the importance of healthy life, I am not scared to emphasize the value of total life as well. In other words, I don't see that there's any real merit in proposing that our goal in the biology of aging is to simply extend healthy life within the currently normal boundaries of total life and then have people just fall asleep and just die in their sleep after having gone to bed in a perfectly good condition. I think that would be rather ridiculous, to be perfectly honest, because how long ago you were born doesn't really affect how long you want to live in the future, not very much anyway, whereas how healthy you are certainly does. So I thought I would just put this slide up first. This is something that many of you are familiar with, but I think it nevertheless is important to recognize that a lot of people get this wrong. A lot of people are inclined to presume that dying from aging means dying of natural causes. In other words, dying in the absence of all of the various nasty diseases of old age that we are all perfectly agreed that we don't want to die of. Cancer and cardiovascular disease and Alzheimer's and so on. And that, that's a colloquial idea of death from aging, but from a biological point of view it's nonsense. Because, of course, there's only one reason, there can be only one reason why the diseases of old age are diseases of old age, why they predominantly affect people who were born a long time ago. And that reason is that they are aspects of the later stages of some process that goes on throughout life and that is initially harmless, initially inert, but that eventually gets in the way of our health and eventually kills us. And of course that process is aging. So death from aging has to, if you have any sort of realistic, rational definition of it, has to include death from all of the age-related diseases. And once one recognises that, one comes up with rather startling numbers for the frequency of death from old age. Roughly 2/3 of all deaths worldwide are from aging. That comes to 100,000 a day, out of the 150,000 a day of all causes added together. In the industrialised world, where not many people die of malaria and such like, the proportion is of course a lot higher, and in fact it's somewhere around 90% these days. So we are talking about something that is pretty unequivocally humanity's worst problem, and even more unequivocally humanity's worst medical problem. Besides, let's face it, I mean, what part of this is a bit hard to understand? Even if you do die of so-called natural causes, you've probably done so after an extended period of debilitation and, general misery, general inability to look after yourself. I think most people would agree that it's preferable to be in the state of the people on the left, even if this guy here is about to have his head bitten off by a shark. So the value of this is fairly unequivocal. And I'll come back to that towards the end of the talk, not so much because I think people in this audience need persuading of the value of medical interventions against aging, but rather because I think it's a good opportunity to give all of you a little bit of the benefit of my experience in talking to people who are not so rational about that topic, because of course all of us do have to have such conversations all the time, to the extent that we choose to, and I would like everyone here to get better, everyone indeed in the whole world to get better once they finally understand that aging is bad for you and that we ought to do something about it. to get better at persuading other people of that. It really is all about advocacy these days. That's really the big stumbling block that's slowing everything down. All right, so back in the day, there was a foundation called the Methuselah Foundation that I founded back in 2003. And the Methuselah Foundation still exists, and its activities are more or less the same as they were when it was started. Namely, its main activities are to administer the various prizes that it started. Initially, longevity prizes for mice for developing unprecedentedly long-lived mice. Somewhere around 2005, the Methuselah Foundation started a second strand of activities, which was essentially being a regular funding body, actually giving money out to professors around the world for specific projects relevant to our goals. And after a few years of that, it became apparent that it would actually be better, especially for messaging reasons, to have that second activity occur in a separate organisation than the one that was organising the prizes. So that's how SENS Foundation came into existence about 2.5 years ago now. And SENS Foundation and the Methuselah Foundation do not have any overlap as personnel. I only work for SENS Foundation, but we are, of course, are completely aligned in terms of our mission, and we certainly talk to each other a great deal. So that's the history of all of this. But SENS Foundation is here. Just like the Methuselah Foundation, we are a 501c3. That's the code word for a US registered public charity. We're based in California. And we're interested in implementing what I've been calling SENS for the past decade, which is the application of regenerative medicine to the problem of aging. So I'm going to spend a few minutes just making sure that we're all on the same page with regard to what the term regenerative medicine means and what the term aging means. Because both of those terms can be defined in a number of different ways, which could lead to misunderstandings. First of all, regenerative medicine. Of course, most people know that stem cell therapy is regenerative medicine, and most people know that tissue engineering, the creation of artificial organs in the laboratory for use in transplants, is also part of regenerative medicine. But there's more to it than that. Really, if you want a definition of regenerative medicine, it has to be rather broad, and it has to look something like this. This has a couple of features that are not obvious to those of you who have simply focused on the colloquial examples of regenerative medicine that I mentioned a moment ago. First of all, the application of that regenerative medicine does not need to be for the repair of acute injury, like, for example, spinal cord damage, which is the sort of thing we tend to hear about in that context in media. It can also be for the repair of chronic, slowly accumulating damage of the sort that we see in aging. Secondly, the type of repair that we do can be at many different scales. What I've mentioned so far is two different scales. We can do it at the whole organ level, replacing the entire organ with one that we've got in the laboratory. Or we can do it at the cellular level, not replacing organs, but repairing the organs by replacing their component cells to the extent that those cells have become unhealthy. And both of those two things are fine, but it's not the whole story. We could go one step further down the ladder, so to speak, and not just replace the unhealthy cells, but repair those cells by restoring the structure and the composition of their inside, or for that matter, by restoring the structure and composition of the material that sits between our cells, such as the extracellular matrix. And it turns out that all of those things are quite important when we come to the concept of applying regenerative medicine to aging. Alright, so that's regenerative medicine. Now, aging is even more fraught when it comes to defining it, because there are an awful lot of definitions of aging out there. And most of them are perfectly fine, they're perfectly uncontroversial. But most of them are completely useless, or very nearly useless, when it comes to our goal today, namely orienting our thoughts with regard to the ways in which we might intervene against aging using medicine. So I'm going to use this definition, not because it's any better in terms of correctness, but unlike the previous definition, but rather because it's useful. And there are two things that I'm saying here. Firstly, I'm saying metabolism eventually causes pathology. Now, metabolism is the word that biologists use to encompass all of the systemic and molecular and cellular processes that go on in our bodies throughout life and keep us going from one day to the next. It's not just oxidative metabolism, the consumption of oxygen. And that's a misunderstanding that a lot of people make because of the phrase metabolic rate, which does simply refer to oxidative metabolism. Okay, so metabolism is everything that goes on in our body, and pathology is the word I'm going to use to encompass all the things that go wrong later in life. The diseases of old age, some of which I mentioned earlier, and also the things that we don't necessarily call diseases, like, for example, loss of function of the immune system or loss of muscle mass, which are certainly bad for us, even though we don't necessarily call them diseases. Alright, so metabolism eventually causes pathology. That's just a cute technical way of saying that aging is a side effect of being alive in the first place. But it's, of course, it's an important thing to have in any definition, at least in any mechanistic definition of aging. But the other thing I'm saying here is a bit less obvious, and it's something that I absolutely want to make sure you all get, because it's going to be the focus of everything else I want to say today. In this definition, we also say how metabolism causes pathology. What we say is, the way metabolism causes pathology is by laying down various types of molecular and cellular alteration to the structure and the composition of the body, and doing so throughout life, even starting before we're born, as immediate side effects of the various processes that make metabolism up. And the key thing about these various changes of composition is that they accumulate, they are progressive throughout life. Because for whatever reason there are no other aspects of metabolism that, if you like, repair that damage as it's being created. So this damage accumulates, and for a long time it's harmless because metabolism has evolved to cope with a certain amount of damage, roughly speaking, enough to get us through to the point where we have reproduced, evolution no longer cares about us. So that's all very well, but metabolism has not evolved to cope with an infinite amount of damage. And that's why eventually, when there's too much damage, metabolism starts not working so well, and pathology of aging emerges. So that's what damage is for the purposes of today's talk. It is the set of intermediates between metabolism and pathology. And the reason why that definition is so useful is depicted in the outline here. So I've got my definition down at the bottom here: metabolism causes damage causes pathology. And using that definition, we can distinguish the two major schools of thought that exist, or have traditionally existed, with regard to the intervention against aging used in medicine. The geriatric approach, as I'm going to call it, encompasses really everything that we have today for medicine for the elderly. And it basically can be defined as treating the diseases and disabilities of old age in just the same way as we treat other diseases that may be independent of age. So that means, identifying the symptoms, characterizing them, going after those symptoms, trying to knock them back and generally stop them from happening. And that's all very well, but of course the problem here is that the geriatrician's job is intrinsically getting harder and harder as the patient gets older, because the target that the geriatrician is going after, these various pathologies, is being created by this accumulating precursor, these things I'm calling damage. The more damage there is, the harder it is for the doctor, the geriatrician, to stop the damage from translating and evolving into pathology. So the geriatric approach is better than nothing, but it's not much better than nothing, and it absolutely never, even in principle, can be much better than nothing. It is not the final solution for the problems of aging. So now, a lot of people, this is not a new idea with me by any means. This is something that people have understood for quite a long time. And a lot of people have felt, well, okay, let's adopt the mantra that prevention is better than cure. Let's go after this process at an earlier point in the chain of events. Let's instead try to clean up metabolism and slow down the rate at which it creates these various types of damage in the first place, which of course would have the right effect if we delay the age at which the damage reaches a pathogenic level. And that's a nice idea. In principle, that could work. But it's got a problem too, a very big problem. Here's the problem. Metabolism is terribly, terribly complicated. I mean really indescribably complicated. This is a small subset, in fact, a simplified diagram, no less, of a small subset of what we know about how metabolism works. And as you can see, it's rather hairy. But actually, that's not the real problem. The real problem is that this is a simplified diagram of a small subset of what we know about how metabolism works. And any biologist will tell you that amount is completely dwarfed by the totally astronomical amount that we don't know about how metabolism works. Even ignoring all the stuff that we don't even know that we don't know. So, it's a failure in principle, but it's an idea whose time has emphatically not come. We need to know so unbelievably much more than we actually do today about how the body really works in order to get this approach to actually get off the ground, and in order to allow us to play with this system without us doing more harm than good. So, we need something else. And of course I wouldn't be here if I didn't have something else. So, what's the something else? Well, I'm going briefly to digress into an analogy about cars, because I find that this is quite a good way of getting the idea across. Here's a car that's rather old. It's more than 50 years old, which is probably 3 times as old as your average car gets to before you start getting a new one. And of course, we know how it got that way, and we know why it lasted unusually long. It was built to last, with corrosion-resistant metal and all those good things. That's very much the same reason why the human body lasts so much longer than the body of a dog or a mouse. It's just that we're built better in the first place. We've got more thorough, more high-quality anti-aging machinery built into us than those sort of lived organisms have. But the really important part of this slide is not actually the picture. It's this up here, the mention of VW bugs, VW beetles. The reason why Volkswagen beetles are mentioned here is because there are just as many 50-year-old Volkswagen beetles driving around the streets of this world as there are 50-year-old Land Rovers. Here's one. And it's doing fine, but it's not doing fine because it was built to last, because it wasn't. In fact, it's doing fine for a completely different reason, namely that it's being well maintained. If you want to make a Volkswagen bug live a long time, you don't turn it into a Land Rover, any more than it would be possible to turn a dog into a human. What you do instead is you simply chip away at the damage that is accruing on that machine as a normal side effect of its normal operation, and periodically repair that damage so that the damage doesn't become pathogenic and the doors don't fall off and so on. And it works, you know. It can, as we see in this case, actually extend the healthy, functioning, fully functioning lifespan of a simple man-made machine, you know, indefinitely, far, far beyond what we might call its warranty period. Now the question then is, what does that mean for the human body? And the answer is very straightforward. The analogy is extremely good. We can describe very clearly a third way, a new approach to combating aging that has been very severely neglected until, well, basically until I came along. And I call it the maintenance approach. What we say here is let's not try and slow down the process whereby damage causes pathology down here, the way the geriatricians are trying to do. And let's also not try to slow down this process where metabolism creates damage in the first place, the way the gerontologists would like to do. Instead, let's uncouple those two processes. Let's separate them from each other so that the damage can be created, but it doesn't cause pathology. And the way we do so is by periodically going in and repairing some or most of that damage so that the overall abundance of damage is kept low. That's what the maintenance approach is. It avoids the problem of the geriatric approach in that it's sufficiently preemptive so that there are no accumulating precursors making the approach progressively harder as the person gets older. And also it avoids the problem of the gerontology approach because here we are not intervening in metabolism itself, and therefore we are effectively sidestepping all of our ignorance about how metabolism works and how it creates these various types of damage. All we need to do is characterize what the damage is and figure out how to repair it while it is still at an inert level of abundance. And the great news is that we have a fair idea how to do that. This is pretty much my one introductory overview of the actual science of SENS. On the left-hand side here we have the 7-point plan, so to speak, the 7 types of damage that are identified and that I claim constitute an exhaustive classification of all of the various phenomena that qualify as damage by the definition I'm using today. And as you can see, these are real biological phenomena. Cell loss, meaning cells dying and not being automatically replaced by the division of other cells. Extracellular junk, molecular byproducts of various metabolic processes which accumulate in the space between our cells because they are, for whatever reason, not subject either to being broken down or being excreted. Similarly, intracellular junk down here, and a few other ones here. So I claim this is an exhaustive classification. I've been claiming it for some time now, and I seem to be getting away with it, so that's pretty good evidence that it's true. And the best news, of course, is that on the right-hand side I have the things that we're supposed to do about all of this. Some of them are already quite a long way along. Certain various stem cell therapies, as many of you will know, are already in clinical trials. So is the approach to getting rid of certain types of extracellular garbage. So that's all pretty good news. And the other ones down here are considerably further away from actual implementation, but they are getting there too. And in fact, they are the focus of what SENS Foundation does. We are a non-profit, and therefore we focus very much on developing proof of concept for things that most people feel are too far out there, too long-term, to justify being taken forward yet into the commercial sector, or for that matter, through a peer-reviewed academic system, which also has a very short-termist attitude when money gets tight, as it is now. Now, I do actually, in that sense, want to mention an important study that came out only a month ago, which is actually a real proof of concept, not funded by us in this case, but we do fund one of the collaborators of this group who are working on very similar stuff. This is a proof of concept of number 4 down here. Death-resistant cells that we get too many of in old age, because even when they get to be dysfunctional, they ignore the signals from the rest of the body telling them to commit suicide, and they hang out. So cells in that state are potentially quite a problem in aging, and if we could get rid of them, that would be great. In this study, the investigators created mice in which, on account of prearranged genetic modifications, it was very easy to get rid of such cells just by administering a simple drug. And secondly, they used mice in which the number of such cells that accumulate is accelerated. There are more of those cells in an animal of a given chronological age than in a normal mouse. And, well, as you can see, it works extremely well. These two mice here are the same age. One of them has had those cells removed about half its lifetime ago, and the other one didn't. I guess you can probably tell which is the healthier mouse. On the right-hand side is just one of the many graphs that there are in this paper showing the actual results at a more microscopic level. This was looking at muscle fiber diameter and showing that it recovers really well when you haven't got these cells around. So this is a fantastic proof of concept, not only of the importance of such cells and getting rid of them in aging, but also of the results of getting rid of them, which is very nice indeed, and really is a big feather in the cap for the whole SENS concept. But I'm not going to spend any more time on that. I'm going instead to spend maybe 10 minutes or more talking about the, probably I would say the flagship project of SENS Foundation at the moment, the one in which we are putting the most amount of resources, which is this one down here, number 6, molecular garbage inside cells. Things that are created, again, just like extracellular junk, as normal byproducts of perfectly essential metabolic processes, but which are not destroyed and not excreted, and therefore they are sequestered. And in this case, we're talking about being sequestered inside the cell. So, about a decade ago, I suggested, a bit more than that actually, I suggested that we might be able to use some technology from a completely different field, actually, from environmental decontamination, to get rid of this stuff. And the problem can be described here. This is just one example. I want to emphasize that this is a problem that underlies a number of the most important age-related diseases. The example I'm showing you here is atherosclerosis. This is a high magnification picture of what's called a foam cell, which is a cell that used to be a perfectly healthy, self-respecting white blood cell, but which has been poisoned by molecular garbage, in this case mainly by oxidized cholesterol. And the poisoning has resulted in it not being able to do its main job, which is to move normal, unmodified cholesterol around, to extract it from the artery wall where something gets stuck, and to rearrange it in such a way that it can continue on its way, doing something called reverse cholesterol transport. So the idea is basically this. I start off with the observation that there is, of course, this range of processes that turn young people into old people and eventually into dead people. But then the key point is that after they're dead, there's something else that goes on. They become decomposed people. And decomposed people have a very different composition than undecomposed people. Specifically, they're composed entirely of bones and teeth. All the other stuff's gone. Why? The answer is because the organisms that are in the vicinity of the dead people in the soil can live off all the rest of the stuff, whereas you can't get much energy just by eating hydroxyapatite. Okay, so then the question is, what organisms? And of course, for many of the things that we're made of, the answer is loads and organisms. Loads of things can eat most of what we're made of. But there are some things we're made of which are pretty hard to break down. And of course, those are precisely the things that accumulate inside cells because we can't break them down in the normal course of our metabolism. So, the question is, why don't those things accumulate in the soil? The answer is because even though most bacteria and microbes also can't break these things down, some can. And what we want to do, therefore, is identify which bacteria are able to do this thing for the hard to break down substances like oxidized cholesterol, and then figure out how they do it, basically do standard molecular biology and cell biology, and apply that knowledge to our own cells. Basically modify our own cells, probably genetically in most cases, so as to augment their ability to break things down, so that they too can break down things that we can't normally break down. And of course that will then combat, that's what this flat-headed arrow means, it will counteract the original process that turned young people into old people in the first place. So the question then is, this is an idea, does it work? Can we actually implement it? Well, it's got many steps. Step one is, can we find the bacteria that actually have the relevant capability? And the answer is, you bet we can. We're damn good at this now. This is an experiment that was actually published in the first paper back in 2008 that was funded by that came out of work funded by SENS Foundation. What we're doing here is what's called an enrichment culture, which is essentially we give various strains of bacteria target substance, and we don't give them anything else to live on. So they have to find some way to break it down, or else they don't grow. And in this case, 5 of the strains of bacteria were exactly like that, nothing happened whatsoever. The 2 of the strains had a well of the time, and after only 10 days, all the stuff was completely gone. So that's what we're looking for, and we've got lots and lots of strains of bacteria that do cool things like that now. Next step is figure out how they do it, as I mentioned, that's the requirement, because we're not looking to actually take these bacteria and just inject bacteria into the body. That would probably be counterproductive. There are various ways to find out what genes are being used to break down the substance we're interested in. This one's called mass spectrometry. We basically identify and break down products. We identify what the bacteria are making in the process of breaking down the target substance. And from that we can infer what enzymatic reaction occurred, and then using bioinformatics we can identify candidate genes that may be involved in encoding those enzymes. That works pretty well. We've got other methods that also work well, and what we sort of it is we now have not only a bunch of bacteria that do interesting things, we have a bunch of genes that enable the bacteria to do interesting things that we have identified. Next step, as I mentioned, is to put those genes into our own cells. And that is not as easy as it sounds, it turns out, because mammalian cells are a lot more complicated inside than what bacterial cells are. So we have to do a bit of messing about to make sure that the enzyme goes to the right part of the cell where the target substance is being stored. And this shows that we can do that. This is rather preliminary data, but it's good enough for the purpose. On the left-hand side is a stain showing the part of the cell that we want to send our enzyme to. It's called the lysosome, and there happens to be an easy way to stain the lysosome in the microscope. In the middle we've got a picture showing where our engineered gene is going after we've made modifications with the intention of sending the enzyme to the lysosome. And on the right-hand side we've got this just an overlay of the other 2 photographs, which as you can see is mainly yellow, which means that by and large the method is working. We are actually getting our enzyme to the right place. So that's nice. Then there's another step, which is, does it actually work? And again, this preliminary data, this is not published yet, and we definitely need more repetition and improvement before we can get it to a publishable standard, but it's getting there. Here, basically what we're showing is not only does the enzyme get to the right place, it does actually help to increase the resistance of cells to this particular toxin, 7-ketoglycerol. The reason why that's not obvious is because the inside of the lysosome, where this stuff is hiding, is actually a very different environment than the bacterial cell. It's got a different pH, for example. And what this shows basically on the right-hand side is if you've got a humongous amount of this toxic stuff, then the enzyme doesn't help. All the cells die pretty quickly. This is just background, basically. This is an assay for viability. But then if you have a relatively more modest amount of the toxic material, then the enzyme does help. Essentially what I'm showing here is the right-hand column, each of these little sets of columns, is cells with the toxin and with our enzyme being targeted to the right place. And the other shorter bars in the corresponding places are various types of control, where, for example, the cells have not been given the enzyme, or they've been given a version of the enzyme that is not targeted to the right part of the cell. So this is good news. The fact that the bars on the right are the tallest ones shows that we've got some success in protecting the cells from this toxin. But even now, we've still got a long way to go. I've told you about steps 1 through 4 here. We're very good at step 1 and 2. We're getting pretty good at steps 3 and 4. But soon, a year or two from now probably, we're going to have to move on to live organisms, live animals, mice in particular. We're going to have to see whether we can get this whole thing to work, not just in cell culture, but in the living organism. And it's a fair bet that we'll hit new problems that we don't know about yet, because that's how science tends to be. So, I think it's going to be quite a little while before we get this whole thing working really well in actual mice. And once we do, then we'll be able to think about clinical trials, but not until then. So this is a big, big ass project. It really is no trivial matter. And I'm not trying to pretend that it's going to be quick. I'm not trying to say that this is easy. All I'm trying to tell you is, number one, that we know where we're going. We have a proper, concrete, detailed project plan. And number two, we better get this working as soon as we can because there's nothing else. The diseases of old age of this type, these what you might call late onset storage diseases, are among the most prevalent and most serious diseases of old age. Cardiovascular disease, macular degeneration, various types of neurodegeneration. It's really not fun. And as I'm sure all of you are aware, these diseases are extremely resistant to treatment by any other means available today. There's only been very modest postponement of these diseases with current medicine, and there's nothing coming down the pipe that's going to be all that much better. So the sooner we start really thinking out of the box and going after approaches like this, the sooner we have some chance of seriously knocking these diseases on the head. And that's the sort of philosophy that SENS Foundation always follows. We are willing to take on really ambitious solutions to the various diseases and disabilities of old age if we perceive that the more simplistic and ostensibly easier solutions are just not going to work very well. Alright, so that's most of the biology of the talk. I'm now going to talk about dramatic extension of healthy life, which of course is the title of my talk, and which is perhaps more of interest to this sort of long-term visionary audience. As you may have noticed, when I put this slide up before, I said this at the top. I didn't say this is going to be the defeat of aging. This is not going on its own to bring aging under the same sort of medical control that we currently have for most infectious diseases, for example. What it's probably going to do, in my view, it's going to achieve the goal that I call robust human rejuvenation, which I define by the numbers up here. That it will add perhaps 30 years of additional healthy life to the lives of people who are already in middle age when we start. So let's say, for sake of argument, 60 years old when we start. What that means is, putting it another way, if we take people like this who are age 60, they won't be biologically 60 again until they're chronologically 90, because we will have repaired their damage reasonably well so that we can stave off the pathology of old age. Alright, so the question then is, how can we go further than that? How can we do more than that 30 years? I mean, 30 years is not so bad. It's nothing to say that, but it's not defeating aging. Now, many of you in the audience will have heard of the concept I'm going to introduce next, the concept of longevity escape velocity. But today I'm going to introduce it a bit more slowly than I normally do, because I've come to realise recently that even though sometimes people get it, they don't explain it to other people very well. And that's probably because once you get it, it's so bleeding obvious that it's actually quite hard to understand how other people get it in the first place. But I think it's worth going a little more step by step. So I encourage you, even those of you who are very familiar with this concept already, to focus on what I'm saying here and see whether you too think it might be a more successful way of getting the idea across to other people. Alright, so what I've shown here is a obviously very simple schematic in which I depict aging and the retardation of aging, the slowing down of aging. So we've got age obviously on the x-axis, and on the y-axis we've got reserve. Reserve is simply the reciprocal of damage, the amount of additional damage that you can afford to accumulate before things start going wrong. So the red line constitutes normal aging, in which you start off at age 0 with not much damage, lots of reserve, time goes on, aging happens, you accumulate damage, your reserve is depleted, eventually you get down to this horizontal dotted line, the frailty threshold, which is where the pathology of old age starts to emerge. And in general, by then, it's pretty tricky to do anything. As I mentioned earlier, the geriatric approach is simply really tough. because the whole thing is some kind of downward spiral after that. Now, supposing we take a therapy that has the ability to slow down the rate of aging, to slow down the accumulation of damage. This is the sort of thing that's going to happen. We're going to extend the period of healthy life, the period before the frailty threshold. We're probably not going significantly to extend the period of frail life because, as I said, the therapies don't really work on pathologies of old age. If the damage is there, the pathologies take off, they just take off. So this is pretty good news in the sense that it extends the healthy period of life without extending the frail period of life between here and here. But there's a bit of a problem for those of us who are getting on, namely that the extent to which it increases healthy longevity depends on how old you are when you start. If you're down here already, let's say age 60 instead of age 30, when the therapy is initiated, then you only get this weeny little bit of extension of healthy life. So that's a bit of a shame, really. The question is, can we do better? Well, there's one way to do better, which is to improve the therapies over time. So in this scenario, what I'm showing, the green line as compared to the yellow line, the therapy is again initiated in middle age, let's say age 60, but before the person hits the frailty threshold, the therapy is subjected to an improvement where it doesn't simply, let's say, halve the rate of accumulation of damage. So the improvements happen and it slows down the rate of accumulation by, let's say, a factor of 4. Okay? So then, of course, you get more of an extension, more of a postponement of the pathology of old age, which is not so bad. That's what we want, really. But as you can see, the further extension achieved by that means is pretty modest. Still, we're not, in this particular scenario, doing as well as we would just by starting earlier, if we could start earlier, which of course we couldn't because the therapy didn't exist at that time. Better than nothing. And that's even when the improvement, the doubling of the efficiency of these therapies occurs quite quickly after the initial therapies have been developed. So if you think about what this might mean in terms of time, we're talking about perhaps only 5 to 10 years between this point and this point. Right? Now, this is very important because it tells us, first of all, why the rejuvenation approach, the repair and maintenance approach, is so incredibly more powerful than the retardation approach. Even if the retardation approach were in fact possible, and I were wrong about everything I said earlier about metabolism being too complicated and that sort of thing. This is what we get with rejuvenation. Notice here that I've only got the yellow line for retardation now, because that's the line I want to talk about. Starting late, starting at age 60, and halving the rate of damage accumulation, and not improving it in time to the person. This is the equivalent, this line is the equivalent for a rejuvenation therapy. Start at the same age, you can only fix half the damage, so that's equivalent to halving the rate, but you can apply that therapy more than once before your hero gets close to the frailty threshold, again and again. Now, of course, each time you apply it, it works less and less well, simply because the difficult damage that the therapy doesn't work on is still accumulating unabated, and eventually on its own it's enough to tip our hero over the frailty threshold. But you can see the whopping difference that you get. And of course, I haven't put any numbers on this graph. It's not qualitative, but you can see the whopping difference that you get in terms of a therapy that is only equally good, but is of this type, this rejuvenation type, rather than the retardation type. That's a really important thing to remember and to get across to people when you're trying to explain this whole reasoning to people who haven't come across it at all before. Now, of course, the big deal comes when we combine these two things. When, on the one hand, we talk about rejuvenation therapies, and also we talk about progress. So remember this progress that I put in here, this business of before our hero who's had his aging rate halved gets to the frailty threshold, they get another halving of the rate of damage accumulation, they get a whole chunk more extra life. That's what you get when they're talking about retardation therapies. This is what you get when you're talking about rejuvenation. Here, even though I'm talking about a longer interval here before the second rejuvenation, longer than the interval I'm talking about down here, I say, well, okay, let's double the comprehensiveness of these therapies at this point. Bang, you're up here. You're fixing not only the damage you could fix before, but also half of the difficult damage. Do the same thing the next time around. You can see what's happening. You don't get diminishing returns. You don't ever get down here. The fundamental difference between the orange line and all the other lines is the orange line never hits the frailty threshold, however long you live. in the long term, people will get biologically younger as they're getting chronologically older. That's the key difference. Just combining two things that give quantitative improvements in healthy life, the improvement of therapies and the change of character of the therapies from a retardation to a rejuvenation, combining those two things that give a quantitative, a certain finite improvement, you get an infinite improvement. It's very counterintuitive unless you've had the argument and thought it through, but it's bleeding obvious once you get it. So that is, of course, the key reason why I talk about dramatic increases in longevity. Just so long as we can achieve this sort of rate of increase in the comprehensiveness of our therapies, doubling their efficacy reasonably frequently, then we will have a general trend here which is upward rather than downward. And of course, therefore, the key question is, how rapidly do we need to accumulate those improvements to the therapy? And I have given a name for that minimum rate of progress. That's what I call longevity escape velocity. The rate at which we need to improve these rejuvenation therapies following the achievement of that initial breakthrough that gives us maybe 30 years of extra life, that thing I call robust human rejuvenation, in order that we can stay one step ahead of the problem and keep our patients genuinely useful for as long as they live. So then the question, of course, is it realistic? Can we actually achieve longevity escape velocity? How likely is it that we will? A few years ago, we did a simulation, a computer simulation of this. It's all published. I can send you reprints, obviously, but the bottom line is here. These are survival curves. The black line here is not a simulation, it's simply a real survival curve. A graph showing the proportion of a given population that are alive at any given age. Obviously, everyone's alive at age 0. Not many of them die until age 50 or 60. Then they start dropping like flies. Hardly anyone gets past 100. That's normal aging for you today. The dark blue line, right next to this, is what happens in the simulation if you take a population that has the same intrinsic risk of death at any given age, but which receives these therapies starting at the age of 80. So that's why the two lines are coincident until here, because half the people are dead before the therapies come along. After that, there's a benefit, but very little benefit, and that's, of course, because this is not about longevity. This is about health, and any longevity benefits that might happen as a result would be as a result. There will be a side benefit of the health benefits. So these people are already not doing very well, and they spend their time, therefore, in a state of reasonably high mortality rate, risk of death each year, which just multiplies up, and the therapists just don't have enough time to pull these people back from the brink. But if people are just a bit younger, just 10 years younger, at age 70 when the therapy arrives, then the story is rather different. That's this red blue line here, in which initially it's the same story, but after a while, the therapies start to get the upper hand, and when you get down here, when people are 150 or 200, then they really are getting biologically like young adults, and the risk of death from any kind of aging is completely eliminated. If you're 60 when the therapies arrive, it's the brown line where nearly half the people get to that state. They enjoy longevity escape velocity. But here's the really important thing about this simulation. In this particular run of the simulation, I was incredibly, insanely over-pessimistic about the rate of progress. Look what I said up here. In these simulations, the therapies are proposed to be doubling in their efficacy, their comprehensiveness, only every 42 years. 42 years. Now, think what that is. That's the interval between Lindbergh flying across the Atlantic and Concorde first flying across the Atlantic. 42 years. So that gives you a feel, even ignoring the whole concept of accelerated change, about which, of course, this community is very familiar. That gives you a feel for just how crazy it is to suggest that this won't happen. What that means is things like this. We do not know how soon we're going to get to robust human rejuvenation. I think we've got a 50% chance of getting there within 25 years from now. Maybe a little more now. But I think that there's at least a 10% chance that we won't get there for 100 years if we just happen to hit a whole bunch of new problems that we haven't thought of before. You know, that's what happens with fundamental breakthroughs. They are very unpredictable in terms of when they're going to happen. We just don't know what problems we're going to hit until we've finished. But incremental refinements of breakthroughs are just not like that. When we look at the history of powered flight, for example, starting in 1903, when the fundamental breakthrough was made, we see a very rapid and very smooth increase in sophistication. We get, Lindbergh only 24 years later. we get the first jetliner, only 22 years after that. We get the first supersonic airliner, Concorde, only 20 years after that. And for those of you who are thinking, well, hang on, where's my flying car then? Let's remember that that's only with respect to commercial air travel. If we look at military air travel, there has continued to be very, very impressive improvement. We now have Mach 5 fighter jets, things like that. So, you know, when there is motivation, which of course there's not going to be any shortage of whatsoever in respect of maintaining people's health, then incremental refinements of breakthroughs, they just happen. And that's what we're talking about when we talk about maintaining longevity escape velocity. So in terms of actual longevity, what this means, and I emphasize again that longevity is a side benefit, it's not the purpose of this, it's a side benefit of extending healthy life. We don't know how old the first 150-year-old is. The world record lifespan today, as you probably know, is 122, but we won't get any 150-year-olds until we have robust human rejuvenation. But, because of the concept of longevity escape velocity, people who are only a little younger than the first 150-year-old will be living to 150 in large numbers, and many of those people will be able to benefit from ever-improving therapies and therefore never see the ill health of old age. And that will, even by very conservative estimates, give those people 4-digit lifespans. We can see that simply by looking at today's risk of death experienced by young adults in the Western world. If you reach the age of, let's say, 26, then your chance of not reaching 27 is less than 1 in 1,000. So of course you're going to get numbers like this. And the reason I say that's conservative is of course because it ignores the possibility, which is, I think you'll all agree, a rather strong possibility, that we will also improve with other technologies and bear down on our risk of death from things that don't have anything to do with aging. So in fact, this is probably an extremely conservative number. Now, as I said at the beginning, I want to spend a little while talking about the ways in which we can get people on side in this respect, which is something that is unbelievably painful. I spend far more of my life doing that than I do doing actual science. I don't exactly resent that, you know, it's part of the job, just waking people up and getting them to be grown-ups about this. But the fact is, it's got to be done. And you're all going to do it. The more of us that are good at this, the better. The first thing that I absolutely have to drum into people's heads all the fucking time, including journalists, because journalists are worse because they spread information, is it's not about longevity. I know that I got into the papers in the first place by talking about 1,000-year lifespan and letting journalists carry on talking about it and not talking too much about health. But the fact is, it's so obvious that the longevity benefits are a side effect, and yet journalists especially just like to ignore that because it doesn't quite sell paper. So you've absolutely got to drum into people's heads that this is all about health. And furthermore, that this is all about real health, not just about being healthy for your age, whatever the hell that means. This is about actually looking, feeling, and functioning in every way, including sex, just as well as you did when you were a young adult. However long you live, however long ago you happen to have been born. People just have an incredible resistance to taking that on board. Even if they say they get it, then the next sentence will betray the fact that they didn't get it, as you will shortly see. First of all, you would be astounded at how many people just say, oh, I wouldn't want to be old all that time. You know, I mean, it's not as if the idea of the longevity benefit being a side effect to health benefit is new with me. Gerontologists have been saying that for decades, for Christ's sake, and nobody listens. People are actively resisting hearing that message. They want to believe that defeating aging is probably a bad idea. So they just refuse to listen to the reasons why they might be wrong. So you've got to beat them over the head with the fact that actually, no, fuck it, we're talking about being young for a long time. Yeah. So, next, people will say, well, okay, I'm going to be young, but I still wouldn't want to live forever. Well, what the hell does that mean? What does it mean to say, I don't want to live to 1,000? It's like saying, it's like having an opinion about what time you want to go to the toilet next Sunday. How about anyone in the audience who does actually have an opinion about exactly what time they want to go to the toilet next Sunday? No, that's not right. Okay. I mean, the reason it's a stupid question is, of course, obvious. It's a stupid question, what time you want to go to the toilet next Sunday, because you know, all of you, that you're going to have much better information on that topic nearer the time. That's all it's about. And it's exactly the same with this. I haven't the faintest clue whether I want to, live to 100. But I certainly do know that I'd like to find out, I'd like to decide whether to live to 100 when I'm 99, rather than having that choice progressively removed from me by my declining health. So again, it brings it back to the fact that it's all about health, but it's also all about choice. Then, of course, there's a billion different sociological and personal objectives that people have, like, well, we put people and, wouldn't dictate to live forever and how we take pensions and so on. I don't think these reservations are stupid. I think it's reasonable to think about these things, and therefore it's also reasonable to have specific, well thought out, well thought through answers to specific things, candidate solutions that we might, as a species, adopt in order to get out of these various problems. But ultimately, that's not the key. What you want to do when you want to really stop people from thinking this way is remind them about an argument that is absolutely general, covers any of the reservations people might have. It's about choice. Ultimately, we do not know what choices humanity in the future, let's say 30 or 50 years from now, is going to want to make with regard to using longevity extension therapies that prevent ill health or age. A large part of the reason why we don't know that is because we don't know what other technologies are going to have come along by then. For example, let's just take nuclear fusion, which might very well exist in 50 years from now, and if it does, then lo and behold, the carrying capacity of the planet is greatly increased because we won't be burning all those fossil fuels. So lo and behold, the overpopulation problem suddenly becomes much more alleviated. If we just say to ourselves, look here, overpopulation, let's not go there, then what we're actually doing is we're condemning a whole population, a whole cohort of humanity to an unnecessarily early, unnecessarily painful death on the basis of we thinking we're so clever that we can say what they would want. Clearly that would be completely immoral. So it's absolutely certain that we need to do it. The last one is actually the one that annoys me the most. Because at least all of the others are just based on misunderstanding, albeit somewhat willful misunderstanding. The last one is just 100% unadulterated 24-carat irrationality. Sometimes what I do, especially when I'm speaking to an older audience about this, because of course it's the older people who tend to say it won't be in time for me, I'll say, okay, hands up everyone who's got kicks. And I let everyone raise their hand. And then I say, right, put your hand down. Now, hand up everyone who's got kids and doesn't give a damn about their welfare. You get the idea, right? People are supposed to care about each other in this world, not just about themselves. And in any other scenario, you wouldn't have a problem with this. Nobody would dream of saying something so egregiously selfish as this. So we have to think about why they're willing to say this to each other, in the presence of their kids in some cases, I can tell you. In this case. The answer is, ultimately, it's the pro-aging trans, by the way. Have I slide on that? No. The pro-aging trans. The fact that until we came up with reasons to actually feel we could combat aging soon, I'll be thinking, that until recently, we just had a rational justification for trying to put aging out of our minds, and coming up with rationalizations, however irrational they might be, for doing so, for pretending that aging is a good thing. It's only now that we're in striking distance of combating aging that makes no sense at all anymore, and it's become an enormous part of the problem. But still, it is an enormous part of the problem, and it's got to stop. So I hope that all of you will learn a little bit about how to actually, do a bit of jiu-jitsu on people with regard to that. Just a reminder, just remind them of that every so often. It's not fun getting old. There's a book that I came up with a few years ago. I'm proud to say that even though it's 4 years old now, it's still pretty good. It's pretty up to date, and there's nothing major that I would provide in it. So for those of you who haven't got it yet, I recommend it. It's cheap. It's semi-technical, by which I mean you don't have to be a trained biologist to understand it, as long as you're willing to go slowly. But it definitely is very thorough. It doesn't cut any corners, so no biologist will feel short-changed. That's it. Thank you. A little bit of time. Do we have a couple of minutes for questions, Ben?
Sure, you can do a minute of questions, but there's going to be a panel a little later.
Oh, is there? Okay. Let's take any questions. You go.
I'd like to ask you a rather personal sort of question.
Go on, speak up there, because you have a microphone.
Your Yeah, this is your life, right? This is your main goal in life.
For the moment.
So here's the personal side. Do you ever feel, I don't know, disturbed, maybe even threatened by the possibility that you're plussing humanity? But what happens when humanity is swamped? I mean, in the sense, there's more computing capacity in a grain of sand than our human brain by, I don't know, calculated once, quintillion, like a million trillion times. So in the coming decades that all this, your work will take to unfold, do you feel sort of threatened and maybe just drowned by
Okay, so I'm sure that might be working, but I'm going to repeat the question. So he was asking, do I feel personally that it's like, threatened by the possibility that the advances in sophistication and speed of computers may simply make humans insignificant, if you like, and therefore make the work like this, whether I might myself benefit or for humanity in general, somewhat less valuable.
Right.
And there's a couple of things I would say. First of all, I think that simply being better at something does not make a machine necessarily cause us to feel as lower worth. Let's take chess machine. Let's not take chess. Let's take Othello. Othello is a board game that some of you may know. I used to play it competitively. I used to be the chairman of the British Othello Federation for more than a decade. I was reasonably good. About 10 years ago, computers started to get very much faster and better at Othello. People actually put some effort into Othello programs. And lo and behold, in half no time, there were programs out there that were vastly better than the best people. But that has had no effect whatsoever on the popularity of Othello in the various countries where it's played, on the enjoyment people have in playing each other. So I don't really think it matters very much. If, however, of course, I think it's probably the important your question, especially for an audience like this, we have computers that can do everything that we can do, much better than we can do it, then of course we're in a very different situation. And I guess the main reason why it doesn't bother me at the moment is because I'm not really much of a believer in recursive self-improvement. I have a feeling that it's not possible. But even without recursive self-improvement, there will, of course, continue to be progressive improvements in the overall general capacities of computers to do stuff that we're pretty good at right now. However, I think without recursive self-improvement, we have an intrinsic participation of the human race in the process of doing the improvement, which I guess from an egotistical point of view, collective ego, shall we say, puts us in a very different scenario in terms of self-worth than if we were entirely out of the improvement loop, as would be the case in a fully autonomous self-improvement situation. Now, of course, there's a whole load of other reasons why we should be scared of fully autonomous recursive self-improvement, and I'm sure we may hear about doing today and tomorrow. And I guess if I think about it much in terms of that possibility, then I think more about the risks than about the self-worth thing. I think that's a relatively minor matter. Okay, I think then we're going to stop, but I gather we have a panel later. Let's go. Let's take it to the panel later on. Nice.
Thank you. Fantastic.